The galaxy's most diverse assembly hall hummed with anticipation aboard Nexus Prime. Today marked the start of an ambitious diplomatic summit, with representatives from hundreds of species, all eager to carve out alliances and set boundaries among the stars. The hall buzzed with languages both organic and synthesized, an endless stream of translators processing sounds, scents, and neural transmissions. Every race was represented, each with a delegation of seasoned tacticians and diplomats who came bearing intricate knowledge of intergalactic strategy and political nuance. The weight of centuries of negotiation techniques filled the air, but a single question hovered on everyone's minds. Where were the humans? Humans were, by galactic standards, a peculiar race. They had entered the intergalactic scene only a few decades prior, and, despite their relative youth and limited technological prowess, had an uncanny knack for integrating with other species. Their adaptability, resilience, and, as some whispered, their capacity for unpredictability made them fascinating allies and dangerous adversaries. But the humans, known for their erratic schedules and tendencies to disrupt protocol, had apparently sent their representative late. And not just any representative, but an older human woman, which puzzled many of the galaxy's delegates. The doors to the chamber finally slid open, and there she was, Ambassador Emma Baker. She wasn't exactly what they had expected. With silver hair pulled back neatly, a serene expression, and an almost delicate frame, she was a stark contrast to the robust, energetic young humans the galaxy had seen in combat or rigorous negotiations. She moved with a dignified grace that immediately silenced the hall, a sort of quiet assurance that settled over her like a cloak. Emma Baker, 72 years old, human grandmother and ambassador to the stars, slowly made her way down the aisle, nodding to various delegates who exchanged perplexed glances as she passed. She was finally shown to a seat at the very back of the chamber, a positioning that in galactic politics signified insignificance, a courtesy placement reserved for minor observers or non-voting guests. A few snickers echoed through the hall as she took her seat without protest, her gaze scanning the room with quiet interest. Seated nearby was the Galaxy delegation, notorious for their rigid views on hierarchy and dominance. They were an imposing species, with towering figures and deep-set eyes that glowed an unsettling shade of red. Their ambassador, Quirax, was particularly famous for his disdain for the lesser races and had a history of dismissive behavior toward those he deemed unworthy of his time. As Emma settled into her seat, Quirax rose, his posture a mix of disdain and arrogance. Without waiting for the human representative to fully settle in, Quirax addressed the assembly. His deep, guttural voice filled the chamber, echoing through translators in a dozen languages. Esteemed delegates of the galaxy, he began, his voice dripping with disdain as his gaze briefly flickered over Emma. We have gathered here for a summit of utmost importance. However, I see that some of our attendees do not quite grasp the gravity of this occasion. He glanced pointedly at Emma, who looked back at him with calm, unblinking eyes. There was no visible reaction from her, though the other delegates sensed an undercurrent of tension rising from her vicinity. A Trivanian ambassador, sitting nearby, leaned slightly toward Emma, a hint of pity in their multiple eyes. Ambassador Baker, perhaps it's best to ignore him. The Galaxy, they tend to test boundaries. Emma offered the Trivanian a gentle smile and whispered back, "Thank you, dear. I've handled my fair share of boundary testing." She placed her hands on the arms of her seat, preparing to rise. There was an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. Those closest to her felt a sudden tightening in their chests, an instinctual unease that tugged at the primal parts of their brains. It was as though some unseen energy had sparked, a silent but powerful warning that most species couldn't quite articulate. The Zoran delegate across the aisle, an empathic species with highly attuned sensory perception, leaned over and whispered, "Ma'am, if I may, it's probably best if you stay seated." Emma's eyes twinkled, but her face remained serene. "Thank you, dear, but I believe it's time I stood up." Slowly, with an effortlessness born of experience, she pushed herself up from her seat. As she rose, the tension in the room grew thicker, palpable, an unseen force radiating from her. Delegates glanced at each other, uneasy and captivated all at once. They couldn't understand it, but something primal, something deeply ingrained in their collective psyches, told them to pay attention. Quirax's expression faltered, his smirk fading as he watched her. This human, a grandmother by the looks of her, was emitting an energy that was nearly tangible, a presence that defied her age and apparent fragility. Quirax was tall and intimidating, but in that moment, he felt a rare flicker of uncertainty. Emma took a single step forward, and then another, her movements slow and deliberate. She held the gaze of every delegate in the room without saying a word. Her silence was powerful, commanding the attention of everyone present. Even Quirax, who was accustomed to using intimidation as a weapon, felt the strength radiating from her. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice soft but carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the minds of everyone present. "Ambassador Quirax," she said, pronouncing each syllable carefully. "I may be an older woman, and I may not have your stature or your reputation, but I've lived through more than you can imagine. I have raised children, helped raise their children, and guided many through hardships that would break even the strongest among you." Quirax shifted, glancing around the room as the rest of the delegates watched in stunned silence. Emma continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "In my time, I've learned patience, resilience, and, most importantly, how to handle beings who think their size or strength gives them authority." She took another step forward, never breaking eye contact with the Galaxy ambassador. "So I will kindly ask that you address me and my people with respect, or I will show you why that is a very, very dangerous mistake." The quiet in the hall was absolute. Delegates who had dismissed Emma's presence minutes ago now sat, rapt, as though held in place by some invisible force. The Zoran delegate whispered to a colleague, "There's something ancient about her. A force. I didn't think humans had such energy." Emma's gaze swept over the room, and she finally addressed the entire assembly. "Humans may be new to this stage, and I may be old, but let me tell you something every human child learns early on. Never underestimate a grandparent. I've spent my life handling those who think they know better, and I have no patience left for those who think they are entitled to dismiss me." Quirax, visibly discomfited, attempted a shaky response. "Ambassador Baker, I meant no offense. It was simply protocol." Emma gave him a small, almost pitying smile. "I understand, Ambassador, and I forgive you. But let this be a reminder." She returned to her seat, and as she did, every delegate felt as though they had been released from a spell. The tension lifted, but the lesson was clear. No one spoke, but all knew that a new unspoken rule had been established in that room. Never, ever make a human grandparent stand up if you don't want to see what happens next. Quirax returned to his seat, visibly shaken. The Zoran delegate leaned over to Emma, still processing the scene. "Ambassador Baker, we'll never underestimate your people again." Emma simply gave a gentle smile, her eyes twinkling with a glint of both kindness and a quiet, hidden strength. "That's all I ask, dear." The incident with Ambassador Emma Baker at the Galactic Summit had already begun to spread, whispers of it flowing through Nexus Prime like a powerful current. From one delegate to another, the story gained embellishments and mythical proportions. A human elder had stood against the towering Galaxy ambassador, Quirax, and reduced him to a stumbling, silent wreck. Each retelling was filled with awe, disbelief, and an undercurrent of fear that spread far beyond the Grand Hall. Even those who hadn't witnessed it in person began to sense that something unprecedented had happened. But the summit was far from over, and the discussions continued into the next day. The assembly hall was buzzing with tension as delegates filed in, cautious, glancing toward the seating arrangement to see if the human ambassador would again be seated at the back. But this time, Emma had been moved closer to the center, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence and the quiet authority she had brought with her. Quirax entered the hall later than usual, his tall frame carrying a stiffness that hadn't been there the day before. His composure had returned, but there was an uneasy flicker in his eyes. For the first time in his career, he had felt truly small, and in his culture, reputation was everything. He could not allow this human, this elderly representative of an upstart species, to damage his standing. He had resolved to confront her directly, to reassert his dominance, and ensure that no lingering whispers remained after this summit. It was a matter of honor. As the delegates found their seats, Emma sat quietly, a calm smile playing on her face as she exchanged pleasantries with those around her. She seemed blissfully unaware of the stir she had caused or the aura of caution that others now showed her. But her demeanor hid a practiced awareness. She knew precisely the effect she'd had and was well aware that Quirax was fuming. As the final delegates settled into place, the first topic of the day was brought forth: interstellar resource allocation. It was a complex and heated subject, as many of the galaxy's factions had begun to compete for the same vital resources scattered across uninhabited regions of space. Each species presented their claims, highlighting their needs and expertise in resource management. But halfway through the proceedings, Quirax's patience finally snapped. He rose abruptly, his towering figure drawing the attention of everyone in the hall, and pointed a sharp claw toward Emma. His voice, a guttural growl, sliced through the ongoing debate like a knife. "Ambassador Baker," he intoned, barely hiding his disdain, "it has come to my attention that your performance yesterday has left certain misunderstandings among our colleagues here." The delegates turned in their seats, shifting their focus to Emma, who remained seated, her expression neutral. She clasped her hands in front of her, her fingers interlocked with a serene patience that only a grandmother could master. She met Quirax's glare without flinching. "Ambassador Quirax," she replied, her voice calm but strong enough to fill the hall. "I'm sorry if you feel any misunderstandings were left. My intentions were clear yesterday, and I assumed everyone had understood them." Her composed response only seemed to anger Quirax further. He stepped forward, his posture stiff with indignation. "Your intentions were irrelevant, Ambassador. It is not your place, nor that of any human, to presume authority in this assembly. You are newcomers here, guests at best, and your kind should show respect by acknowledging those who have governed these halls for centuries." Emma nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words. Then, she slowly rose from her seat. Her movement, though gentle, drew every eye in the hall. There was a flicker of recognition among the delegates, the same feeling that had rippled through them the day before. A sense of ancient, quiet power filling the air. Once again, that primal instinct, buried deep within each species, surfaced, warning them to pay close attention. "Ambassador Quirax," she began, her voice calm, but tinged with a subtle force that seemed to vibrate through the room. "You speak of authority, of respect. You imply that age in these halls is what defines worth, what merits respect. But let me explain something about humanity." She took a step toward him, her presence growing as she spoke, an aura that seemed to draw the gaze of every delegate in the hall. "Where I come from, age is not a measure of time spent in a position of power. Age is a measure of resilience, of experience, of battles fought and won. Not with weapons, but with the will to endure, to protect, and to rise again, no matter the circumstances." The Zoran delegate leaned closer to his colleague, eyes wide with awe. I feel it again," he whispered, barely able to take his eyes off her. "It's as if she's drawing from something ancient." Emma continued, undeterred by the growing silence in the hall. "I may not have your centuries of interstellar protocol, Ambassador, but I have spent decades fighting battles you cannot imagine. I have faced fear, loss, and hardship that would crush the unprepared. And above all, I have learned to value respect, not for one's status, but for their ability to withstand life's trials and emerge stronger." Quirax, visibly unnerved, opened his mouth to reply, but Emma silenced him with a single raised hand. "You assume that humanity is weak because we are young on this stage. You assume that my age makes me feeble. But I have lived long enough to see entire generations rise and fall, to teach children who have gone on to shape worlds, and to face down threats that would chill even your blood, Ambassador." The hall was silent, every delegate frozen in place, captivated by the force of her words. Emma's gaze swept across the room, holding each delegate in a quiet, unbreakable bond. "And there is something else you should know about human grandparents," Ambassador Quirax, she said, her voice softer now, but carrying a warning that was unmistakable. We do not stand for disrespect. We may be patient, and we may forgive, but we are not here to be bullied. A murmur spread through the assembly as delegates from countless species exchanged glances. Emma's words held a power that seemed to transcend language, touching something primal in each of them. The beings who understood hierarchy and strength as a way of life began to feel a newfound respect for the human ambassador. Quirax, visibly shaken, attempted to regain control. This display is unbecoming of a diplomat. I suggest we return to the matters at hand. Emma held her gaze on him for a moment longer before finally nodding. I agree, Ambassador. Let us return to the matters at hand. Her words were measured, but the warning was clear, and no one doubted that Quirax had felt it. As she returned to her seat, the delegates watched her with a newfound reverence. In that moment, Emma Baker had shifted something fundamental in the collective consciousness of the galaxy's races. She had shown them a new kind of power, one that did not rely on physical strength, technological superiority, or ancient protocols. It was a power born of resilience, patience, and a strength of character that resonated deeply across species and cultures. The summit resumed, but the tone had changed. No longer did the delegates dismiss the human ambassador as an odd choice. She had earned their respect in a way that transcended protocol or tradition. And as discussions progressed, it became clear that Emma's influence was spreading. Delegates spoke to each other with a renewed patience, a sense of mutual understanding that had not been present before. Emma, for her part, contributed quietly, offering insights that bridged the gaps between the various factions. The day's discussions concluded, and as the delegates prepared to leave, the Trivanian ambassador approached Emma with a deep bow. Ambassador Baker, they said, their voice a mix of gratitude and admiration. I believe the galaxy will not soon forget what it has learned from you. Emma smiled, her expression softening. Thank you, dear. I only hope that this respect carries forward, not just for humanity, but for all who have something to teach. As she departed the hall, whispers followed her, stories that would spread far beyond Nexus Prime. Every species there would carry with them the tale of the human grandmother who had stood against the mighty Glaxty, reminding them all that true strength sometimes lay hidden in unexpected places. And from that day forward, every race knew, never, ever make a human grandparent stand up unless you were prepared to witness the strength of their spirit. The galaxy had changed since Ambassador Emma Baker's quiet yet powerful stand in the halls of Nexus Prime. Whispers of her confrontation with the Glaxty ambassador, Quirax, had reached the far corners of known space. Among all the tales of humanity's resilience and adaptability, none were as compelling or as widely circulated as the story of the elderly human ambassador who had, with a calm and steady presence, humbled one of the galaxy's most formidable figures. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, woven into the diplomatic fabric of the galaxy. And for the first time, a newfound respect and caution surrounded humanity and their elders. The final day of the summit was set to address key resolutions: resource distribution, shared defense treaties, and the alignment of new policies regarding first contact procedures. Tensions ran high. This was where many of the debates would come to a head, and the stakes were at their peak. Emma Baker entered the assembly chamber to find her position had again changed. This time, not only was she seated prominently near the center, but her chair had been upgraded to a platform with the same design and elevation as the Federation's senior members. It was a gesture laden with meaning, and she nodded with a gracious smile to the officials who had made the adjustment. Her entrance alone sent a wave of silence across the hall. Conversations paused, and eyes turned her way with respect, curiosity, and a hint of reverence. The delegates, representing countless races with their own cultures, histories, and values, had all heard of her quiet power, her steadfast resilience, and the grandparent rule that had become an unspoken commandment across the galaxy. Do not make a human grandparent stand up unless you truly understand what you are asking for. As Emma took her seat, a subtle stir went through the room. Today, the entire assembly would be watching her more closely, eager to see how she would handle the day's most sensitive discussions. But while others had come prepared for battle, Emma arrived with the same calm, steady demeanor that she had shown since the beginning of the summit. The first topic of discussion was one of the most divisive: resource allocation across disputed regions of space. Planets rich with rare minerals, asteroid belts teeming with precious metals, and gaseous worlds that contained elements crucial to interstellar travel. These were lifelines for many species, and tensions had escalated with each new claim. The Trivanian ambassador began the discussion, outlining their species' need for a stable supply of thermium, a rare mineral crucial to their energy production. They argued that their proximity to the thermium-rich sector and their expertise in environmentally conscious mining practices made them the ideal custodians of the resource. Emma listened intently, nodding as the Trivanian explained their case. Next, the Zoran delegate spoke up, expressing their concern that if resources were concentrated under a few species, others would suffer. They advocated for a centralized system of distribution under the Federation's oversight, ensuring equal access to the vital minerals. Their proposal, while idealistic, was met with murmurs of skepticism. Many species feared that such centralization would diminish their sovereignty. The Galaxy delegation remained silent through these discussions, with Quirax sitting stiffly, his jaw clenched as he listened. His gaze occasionally flicked toward Emma, as though he were gauging her response to the unfolding debate. After nearly an hour of heated discussion, Emma finally raised her hand, and the hall fell silent. She rose gracefully, her every move watched with intense curiosity. Clearing her throat, she began to speak in her calm, measured voice. "Esteemed delegates," she started, nodding respectfully to the assembly, "I've listened carefully to each of you, and I understand the importance of these resources to your peoples. On Earth, we've had our own struggles with resource management. We, too, once faced shortages and disputes that threatened to turn brother against brother. I don't think it's all that different here, even though we're discussing this on a much larger scale." Her gaze swept across the room, and her voice softened, taking on a storytelling quality that drew everyone's attention. "Back home, I remember a time when my own community went through a crisis. The winters were harsh and firewood was scarce. Families began to compete for limited supplies, and neighbors who once helped each other began to turn cold and distant. It was heartbreaking to see." Several delegates leaned forward, intrigued. To most, it was still strange to think of something as simple as firewood being significant. But Emma's tone made them feel the weight of it. She continued, "One evening, a group of us gathered, much like we are today, and an elder, a man much older than myself, spoke up. He reminded us that we weren't just individuals competing for survival. We were a community, bound by a shared purpose. Instead of hoarding what little we had, we began pooling our resources. Those who had a bit more firewood shared with those who didn't. Those who were young and strong helped chop wood for those who were not. And by working together, we made it through the winter." Emma paused, allowing her words to settle. The delegates seemed transfixed, contemplating her story and the underlying message. "Now, I understand that our situation here is far more complex," she said, "but I believe the principle remains the same. We can either fight for control over resources, weakening each other in the process, or we can find a way to support one another, even if it means making small sacrifices." The Trivanian ambassador, clearly moved, spoke up. "Ambassador Baker, are you suggesting that we share control? That we treat these resources as communal rather than sovereign property?" Emma smiled, a warm and genuine expression. "Not exactly. I'm suggesting that we remember why we're here. We're not just representatives of isolated races. We're members of an intergalactic community. If we continue to act out of self-interest, we risk undermining the very unity we've gathered here to build." Her words resonated deeply, and murmurs filled the room. Delegates began to exchange glances, reassessing their positions, seeing their rivals in a new light. The Galaxy ambassador, however, was visibly displeased. He rose, his voice a low growl. "What you suggest is naive, Ambassador. Cooperation is all well and good in a small community, but this is the galaxy. Our needs are too great, and our people too diverse, for simple sharing to be a realistic solution. Emma looked at him calmly. Perhaps it's not simple, Ambassador, but it's necessary. We can't ignore that diversity comes with challenges, but it also brings strength. I have faith that, with patience, even those with different values can find common ground. Quirax sneered. This is precisely the sort of thinking that makes your people vulnerable. You speak of community, of compassion, but that's because you're weak. The Glaxti do not compromise. We take what we need to ensure our survival. Emma let his words hang in the air, then replied, her voice gentle but unwavering. Ambassador Quirax, perhaps it is you who misinterpret strength. It's easy to demand, to take, to dominate. But real strength lies in finding balance, in having the courage to work with others, even when it would be simpler to stand alone. Quirax seemed at a loss, his arrogance meeting a wall he couldn't scale. For a moment, he appeared ready to retort, but the quiet, steady gaze of Emma Baker held him in place. In the end, he simply sat down, grumbling under his breath. Emma turned to the rest of the assembly. If we cannot find it in ourselves to cooperate, then we risk repeating the mistakes of so many who came before us. I ask each of you to look beyond your immediate needs and consider the generations that will follow. What kind of galaxy do we want them to inherit? A silence filled the room, profound and introspective. The delegates, who had arrived prepared to defend their positions fiercely, now felt the weight of Emma's words, a realization settling over them. She wasn't just an ambassador for humanity. She had become a moral anchor, a reminder that they were all bound by more than just survival. One by one, representatives from the various species rose, expressing their willingness to explore a shared stewardship model over key resources. Even those who were hesitant agreed to a trial period, understanding that Emma's vision was worth at least exploring. As the summit drew to a close, Emma returned to her seat, her mission accomplished. The Trivanian ambassador approached her, bowing deeply. Ambassador Baker, your wisdom has changed us all. I believe history will remember this day as the beginning of something remarkable. Emma smiled, a mix of humility and warmth in her expression. Thank you, dear. I only hope that we all remember it, and that we carry this lesson forward. With the summit adjourned, Emma prepared to leave Nexus Prime. But as she turned to go, a young Federation official approached, a curious look in his eyes. Ambassador Baker, may I ask, how do humans cultivate such resilience, such strength? Emma looked at him with a gentle smile. We learn it from those who came before us, she replied simply. We carry the wisdom of our elders, those who endured, who protected and taught us. We are strong because we are a part of something greater, a legacy of resilience that we pass on. And with that, she departed, leaving behind a galaxy forever changed by the quiet, unyielding strength of one human grandparent. And across the stars, it became a known truth. Asterisk never.